There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a hospital room at 11 at night, when the machines have settled into their rhythm and the hallway lights have dimmed to that dull amber glow. I was sitting up in bed with a clipboard in my lap and a pen in my hand, my hip wrapped and throbbing under the blanket, when a nurse I'd only met that afternoon leaned down close to my ear and said 5 words that would end up unraveling everything I thought I knew about my own son. "Don't sign that discharge paper." I looked up at her. "Her name tag," said Renata. She wasn't smiling. She glanced once toward the door, where my son Derek had just stepped out to grab coffee, and then back at the stack of forms clipped in front of me. Forms he had filled out himself, forms he had already dated, forms that only needed my signature at the bottom of page 3. Just page 3, he'd told me 20 minutes earlier, tapping it with his finger. It's routine. It just makes things easier while you heal. I want to tell you that I felt something click into place right then, some dramatic bell of recognition. I didn't. What I felt was tired and sore and grateful that my son had come at all. It's strange, looking back, how close I came to signing my whole life away because I was tired and didn't want to make a fuss. But I want to back up. Because to understand why a stranger in scrubs had to be the one to stop me, you have to understand who I'd spent 68 years quietly becoming, and who my son had spent the last year quietly deciding I no longer was. My name is Margaret Calloway. Everyone except my late husband called me Margaret. Walter called me Peg, and after 39 years of marriage and 4 years of widowhood, I still catch myself waiting for someone to call me that again. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a converted brick house on Colburn Street in Toledo, Ohio, the kind of place with hardwood floors that creak in a specific, familiar pattern depending on which room you're crossing. I retired 3 years ago from Fenwick Tool and Die, where I'd worked as the head bookkeeper for 26 years, the woman who reconciled every invoice, caught every discrepancy, and knew the difference between a rounding error and a problem before either one ever reached the owner's desk. It was not glamorous work. It was exact work. I was good at it in the quiet, unglamorous way that nobody throws a party for. These days my mornings are smaller. I make 1 cup of coffee in a percolator that used to make 2. I feed my cat, Biscuit, an orange tabby who has strong opinions about breakfast timing. Most days, weather allowing, I walk 4 blocks to Fowler Park and back, and on Tuesdays and Fridays I stop at the wrought iron table outside Denny's Hardware, where my neighbor Harold Whitmire, 74 and retired from the school district, sets up a chessboard and beats me roughly 60% of the time. I keep a small notebook where I've logged our results since March. It's a silly, stubborn habit. It's mine. My building has 6 units, and I know all of my neighbors by name, which apparently is unusual these days. The couple downstairs, the Petrozans, leave their porch light on for me if I'm out past dark. I still balance my own checkbook by hand, on paper, even though the bank sends everything digital now. Old habits, Walter used to tease, are just habits that have proven themselves. I keep his flannel jacket on a hook by the door, not because I expect to wear it, but because the hallway looks wrong without it there. I raised 1 son. Derek is 41 now, married to Vanessa, and they have 2 children. Sophie, who is 9 and reads faster than I can keep books on the shelf for her, and Milo, who is 6 and has never once in his life used an indoor voice. Derek works in commercial real estate, or he did for most of the last decade. The last year or so, when I asked how work was going, the answer had gotten shorter and vaguer each time. I didn't push. You learn, as a mother, when a door is closing gently and when it's being slammed, and Derek's door had simply been closing gently, an inch at a time, for months. I told myself it was just a busy season of his life. I had been telling myself that for a while. The first time I really felt it was at Thanksgiving, 14 months before the hospital, at Derek and Vanessa's house in Sylvania. I'd brought my mother's sweet potato casserole, the one with the pecan crust, the one I'd made every year of Derek's childhood. I set it on the counter and Vanessa glanced at it and said, mostly to the room, "Oh, we're actually doing a modern menu this year. Maybe next to the fruit tray." It went on the fruit tray. Nobody touched it. I told myself it was a small thing, and it was. I ate a slice of pie instead and didn't say anything. Later that evening, over decaf, Derek's business partner Kyle was there, and the conversation turned to a warehouse deal Derek was closing. I asked, honestly curious, what the financing structure looked like, 26 years of bookkeeping doesn't just evaporate. And Derek laughed, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, and said, Mom, it's a little more complicated than the shop ledger. Kyle chuckled. I smiled and changed the subject to Sophie's reading list. Small thing. I let it go. The second time was at Sophie's 9th birthday in the spring. I'd spent 3 weeks knitting her a cardigan, pale yellow with tiny embroidered daisies along the collar, the kind of gift that takes patience I don't always have anymore in my hands. When she opened it, Vanessa said, brightly, in front of the other parents, "Oh, how sweet. Very grandma core." And there was a ripple of polite laughter, and Sophie, God bless her, wore it anyway, but I noticed Vanessa steer her toward the pile of gift cards and electronics afterward, as if my cardigan needed an apology attached to it. I folded my hurt up small and put it away, the way I'd learned to do. The third time was this past summer, at a cookout at my own son's house, when I overheard. I wasn't meant to hear it. They were by the grill, and I was coming back from the bathroom. Derek telling Kyle, "She's not always all there anymore, you know?" Repeats herself. We're keeping an eye on it. I stood in the hallway with my hand on the wall for a full minute before I walked back outside smiling. I do not repeat myself more than any other person my age. I do forget where I've set my glasses down sometimes. I have never, not once, forgotten which grandchild is which, what year it is, or how much money is in my own checking account. But I said nothing that day either, because what do you say? I heard you, and it isn't true, without sounding exactly like the thing you're trying to deny. The fourth time was smaller than all the others, and somehow it was the one that actually kept me up that night. It was late August, a Sunday dinner, and I mentioned, just in passing, that I'd been thinking of getting the roof on my building looked at before winter, a conversation for my landlord, nothing more. Derek set down his fork and said, "Mom, maybe let me and Vanessa handle stuff like that from now on. It's a lot for you to manage on your own. A lot for me to manage." I had managed a manufacturing company's books for a quarter of a century. I had managed a household, a marriage, a mortgage, a husband's cancer, and a funeral, alone, at 64. A leaking gutter was not, in fact, a lot for me to manage. But I only nodded, because arguing would have proven whatever point he seemed determined to make about me, and because some tired, hopeful part of me still wanted to believe he meant it kindly. There was a fifth moment, too, one I almost forgot to count because it didn't happen in front of anyone else. It was a phone call, early September, Derek asking, casually, the way you ask about whether I still had the title to my car, just in case something ever happened and things needed to move fast. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and biscuit winding around my ankles, and something in the phrase "things needed to move fast" snagged on me in a way I couldn't name yet. I told him the title was in my lockbox, which was true, and I did not tell him where the lockbox was, which was also true, and I hung up feeling unsettled in a way I chalked up to being tired. Looking back, I can see now that each of these moments was doing two things at once. On the surface, they were small unkindnesses, the kind every family absorbs and forgives without much thought. A dismissed casserole, a mocked cardigan, an unkind word overheard by a grill. But underneath, they were also groundwork. Every time Derek called me confused, or repetitive, or unable to manage a leaking gutter, he was building a story for an audience I didn't know existed yet. A story that would need witnesses later, people who could nod along and say yes. We'd noticed she'd been slipping. I didn't know yet that handling stuff for me had already begun, months earlier, in places I couldn't see. It happened on a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning where the first hard frost catches you off guard. I was walking to meet Harold for our regular game, my boots hitting a patch of black ice I never saw, and my hip took the brunt of it against the curb. I remember the sound more than the pain at first, a flat, wrong sound, and then the pain arrived all at once and didn't leave. Harold found me 11 minutes later because I hadn't shown up, and he came looking, which is the kind of neighbor he is. By that evening I was at St. Vincent's with a hairline fracture in my hip, admitted for observation, on painkillers that made the ceiling tiles swim a little if I looked at them too long. Derek arrived the next morning with a folder. Not flowers. Not Biscuit's favorite treats for me to hold, the silly kind of thing Walter would have brought. A folder, tan, with a rubber band around it, and inside it, papers. I talked to the case manager, he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. not quite meeting my eyes the way he used to when he was small and had broken something. Given the fracture and your age, they think it makes sense to set up a short-term care plan. Some paperwork so I can help manage things while you're healing. Insurance, bills, all of it. It's honestly just a formality. I looked at the papers. There was a lot of language I would have caught instantly 6 years ago and doped up on the second day after surgery, mostly skimmed instead. Durable power of attorney. Financial. Full authority. A line about residential care placement that I didn't understand and didn't ask about, because Sophie was there, sitting in the corner chair swinging her legs, and children have a way of asking the question adults are too polite to ask. "Grandma," she said, not looking up from her book, "are they trying to take your house?" The room went very still. Derek said, too quickly, "Soft, that's not. Go find your brother." And she went, but she'd already said it, and it hung there in the air between the beeping monitors like something that couldn't be unsaid. 9 years old, and she'd heard something in her own parents' conversation that I hadn't let myself hear yet. I asked him, once, what residential care placement meant, and he waved it off. "It's just a fallback clause, Mom. Standard hospital language. Nobody's putting you anywhere." I remember believing him in the moment, or wanting to, because the alternative, that my own son was sitting on the edge of my hospital bed and lying to my face while I was full of oxycodone and gratitude, was not a thought I was equipped to hold at 11 that morning. Vanessa called once, briefly, to say she hoped I felt better soon, and I could hear Milo shrieking about something in the background, and then the call ended before I could ask her anything at all. That night, Nurse Renata came in to check my vitals, glanced at the folder still sitting on my tray table, and lowered her voice. "Mrs. Calloway, I've seen this kind before. Not saying anything about your family specifically. But that page 3, that's not a routine care form. That's a full financial power of attorney and a pre-authorization for a memory care facility. Willowbrook, it says. You don't have a diagnosis on your chart that would call for that." I checked. She straightened up, businesslike, but her eyes were kind. "Don't sign anything tonight. Sleep on it. That's all I'm going to say. I did not sleep much that night, but I did not sign." Here is the thing I want you to understand about how I responded, because I know what people expect from a story like this: shouting, a scene, a mother's righteous fury thrown across a hospital room. That is not what happened, and I've thought a great deal since about why. The next morning, when Derek came back with coffee and a pen already clicked open, I said, calm as I could manage, "I'm not signing today." His face did the thing faces do when a plan hits an unexpected wall. "Mom, it's just paperwork. You're overthinking this because of the meds." "Maybe," I said. "So there's no harm in waiting a few days, is there?" He got loud then, not shouting exactly, but sharp, the volume of a man used to closing deals by pressure. "Do you know how hard I've had to work to set this up? Do you have any idea what it's been like managing everything for you?" His voice cracked up half an octave on everything, and a woman 2 beds down glanced over through the curtain gap. I didn't raise my voice back. I want to be honest, it wasn't because I'm a saint. It was because somewhere under the fog of the painkillers, the bookkeeper in me had woken up fully for the first time in months, and she does not do her best work loud. She does her best work quiet, patient, and exact. So I simply said, "I'll let you know when I'm ready," and asked the nurse for water, and Derek left the folder on the table and stormed out to make a phone call in the hallway I could hear, but not decipher. "You're seriously going to make me wait around while you second-guess me?" he said, from the doorway, coat half on. "After everything I've had to juggle?" "I'm going to wait," I said, "until I understand what I'm signing." "That's not the same thing as second-guessing you." He left without saying goodbye. I sat with that for a while after the door swung shut, the particular quiet that follows a slammed exit, the way a room keeps vibrating slightly even after the noise has stopped. Vanessa texted an hour later. "Derek's really stressed. He's just trying to help. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I read it twice and did not answer it that day. People confuse restraint with weakness all the time. I've come to believe it's closer to the opposite. Rage burns fast and hot and leaves you with nothing but ash and an apology to write later. Restraint is a longer fire. It keeps you warm long enough to actually get somewhere. I had spent 26 years learning that the person who raises their voice first in a dispute over numbers is usually the person with the weakest column to defend. I did not intend to have the weakest column. I intended to have the correct one, and I intended to be the calmest person in every room until I did. That afternoon, from my hospital bed, I called an old friend. Here is what my son did not know about me, because I had never had a reason to tell him. Before Fenwick Tool and Die, I spent 6 years, in my 30s, working in the fraud examination division of a regional bank, tracing embezzlement and forged signatures for a living. I let that part of my resume go quiet when I moved into private sector bookkeeping because it paid better and Walter's job had just moved us to Toledo. But you don't unlearn a skill like that. You just stop using it out loud. And for the past year, quietly, I had been using it. It started small. A statement that didn't quite reconcile the way it should have. $60 unaccounted for in April, which I chalked up to my own error until it happened again in May. Then June, in slightly larger amounts. Always timed a few days after I'd given Derek my debit card, just to grab groceries while I babysat, or just to run to the pharmacy for you. By August, I had stopped handing him that card at all, quietly switched banks for my primary checking, and started keeping a private ledger, an actual physical ledger, the old kind, the kind I used to keep for Fenwick, logging every discrepancy, every date, every dollar. 26 years of habit does not turn itself off. When something doesn't add up, I write it down. By October, before I ever slipped on that patch of ice, my ledger showed just over $47,000 moved out of accounts connected to my name over 14 months. Small withdrawals disguised as reimbursements. 2 loans I never agreed to that showed up as line items on a joint account Derek had talked me into opening for convenience after Walter died. And 1 unauthorized transfer against a certificate of deposit that had been my husband's retirement money. I hadn't gone to the police yet. I'd been gathering proof the way I always gathered proof, quietly, completely, before I moved. I also had a flash drive. On it, bank statements, screenshots, the notarized durable power of attorney I actually held, an old one, from years back, granting me sole authority over my own affairs, one Derek apparently believed he could quietly replace with a new one while I was sedated in a hospital bed. In a letter, handwritten, that I'd started the week I found the first discrepancy, addressed to no one in particular, the kind of letter you write when you're trying to convince yourself you aren't imagining things. I still remember the training room at the bank on Erie Street where I learned to read a ledger the way other people read a face. For the small tell, the digit that sat half a beat wrong, the transaction dated on a Sunday when the business in question was closed. My supervisor then, a meticulous man named Frank Iosa, used to say that fraud rarely announces itself. It just makes small, repeated, reasonable-sounding excuses over and over until the pattern is the only honest thing left in the file. I hadn't thought about Frank Iosa in years. I thought about him a great deal that week in the hospital, flipping through my own handwritten ledger under the fluorescent light, recognizing my son's excuses for exactly the shape they were. The friend I called from my hospital bed was Carol and Whitfield, an elder law attorney I'd known since our daughters. Hers, not mine. I only ever had Derek. We're in Girl Scouts together 30 years ago. I asked her to come to the hospital. I asked her to bring a laptop. Carol arrived the next afternoon in a gray blazer, unhurried, the way competent people tend to be. She didn't raise her voice once. She read through Derek's folder page by page, then plugged in my flash drive and read through that too, occasionally making a small sound in her throat that I'd learned, over the years, meant found something. "Margaret," she said finally, "this power of attorney he's asking you to sign would replace the one you already hold, the one naming yourself as your own agent. And this admission form isn't a rehab step-down. It's a long-term memory care intake." "Based on what?" She flipped back through my chart. "There's no cognitive diagnosis anywhere in here. Just a hip fracture." She also asked, gently, whether I'd consent to a formal cognitive assessment, not because she doubted me, she said, but because if this went further, and it looked like it might, a documented, dated evaluation from a physician would matter more than either of our opinions. I agreed. The hospital's geriatric care physician, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Ose, spent 40 minutes with me the next morning. Memory recall, orientation, reasoning, the works. And at the end of it he looked at his notes, and then at me and said, plainly, without ceremony, "Mrs. Calloway, your cognitive function is entirely intact for your age. There's nothing here that would support a memory care placement." He wrote it up. He signed it. It went in my file. Carol and also brought in someone else, a caseworker from Adult Protective Services named Investigator Lynn Faraday, a calm woman in her 50s who had clearly done this exact kind of conversation more times than she could count. She sat by my bed, not with a badge held out dramatically, just a folder of her own and a recorder she asked permission to use, and she went through my ledger line by line with the same unhurried patience Carol had. "This is thorough," she said at one point, almost to herself. "Most people who come to us have a feeling something's wrong. You have a paper trail." "I used to do this professionally," I told her. "I can tell." She tapped the ledger's spine. "This will hold up. I want you to know that. Whatever you decide to do with it, press charges, seek restitution, both. This is exactly the kind of documentation that makes a case, instead of just a suspicion." She asked careful, methodical questions after that. When I'd first noticed the discrepancies, whether anyone had pressured me to sign anything before, whether I felt safe at home. I answered each one honestly, and she wrote each answer down without embellishment, the way I imagined she'd written down 100 other answers from 100 other people who'd sat where I was sitting. There was no drama in the room. That, more than anything, was what convinced me I was finally being taken seriously, not because anyone raised their voice on my behalf, but because no one needed to. Dr. Osei's evaluation went into my chart the same afternoon. One clean paragraph, no hedging. Intact orientation, intact recall, intact executive function. No indication for a memory care level of placement at this time. He didn't make a show of delivering it. He simply set his tablet down, looked at me, and said, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Calloway, I trust your judgment on most things in this hospital more than half the residents I supervise." It was the first time in over a year that anyone in a position of authority had said, plainly, that my mind was exactly as sound as I had always known it to be. They called Derek in on a Thursday, 10 days after my fall, in a small conference room down the hall from my recovery unit. Not a courtroom, nothing that dramatic, just a table, 4 chairs, a box of tissues nobody had touched yet. He came in loud before he was even fully through the door. "What is this?" "Mom, what did you—" "Sit down, Mr. Calloway," Investigator Faraday said, not unkindly, just firm the way a good teacher is firm. He sat. Carol laid the ledger on the table, then the bank statements, then, last, the printout of the unauthorized transfer against his father's CD. $47,312, Carol said, moved out of accounts belonging to your mother over the past 14 months, without her documented authorization. Alongside a discharge form filed at this hospital requesting a power of attorney transfer and a long-term memory care placement, despite a cognitive evaluation performed 2 days ago showing no impairment. Derek's face went through several colors. "I can explain the transfers. I'd like to hear it," Faraday said. He looked at me then, really looked, for the first time since he'd walked in with that 10 folder 10 days earlier. "Mom, I was going to pay it back. I got behind. The Sylvania deal fell through. Kyle and I lost the deposit on the warehouse, and Vanessa doesn't know how bad it got. And I needed breathing room. And I told myself I'd fix it before you noticed, and then when I couldn't fix it fast enough, I thought if I just handled things, I could buy more time without you ever having to worry about any of it." "Handling things," I said quietly, "meant a memory care facility I don't need." He didn't answer that one right away. His voice, when it came back, had lost all its earlier volume. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled I'd undo it, and you'd never have to know how close I let it get. "I know how that sounds now. Why the memory care form, Derek?" Carolyn asked. "That's a separate question from the money." He was quiet a long moment. If she had a placement in progress, the bank flagged the accounts as being managed under family care. It made the transfers look routine instead of— He stopped himself. "Instead of theft," Faraday said, not unkindly, just precisely. "Instead of theft," he repeated, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Nobody in that room raised their voice again after that. Faraday laid out, calmly, what would happen next, that this rose to the level of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio law, that she'd be filing a formal report, that criminal charges were a real possibility unless a documented restitution agreement was reached and honored, that the fraudulent power of attorney and the memory care admission would be voided immediately with Dr. Osei's evaluation on record. She was not performing outrage on my behalf. She didn't need to. The facts did that on their own, laid flat on a table between us, the same way I'd always laid a mismatched ledger flat on Mr. Fenwick's desk decades ago, and let the numbers make the argument I didn't have to raise my voice to make. I did not press criminal charges. I want to be clear that this was my choice, made with a clear head, not something anyone talked me into. Carol and drew up a structured restitution agreement instead. The full $47,312, repaid over 4 years, with the first payment due within 30 days and monthly statements sent directly to Carolyn's office, not to me, so I would never again have to be the one keeping the ledger on my own son. Investigator Faraday kept the file open for a year of monitoring, standard procedure, she said, in cases involving a vulnerable adult and a family member. The old power of attorney, my own, stayed exactly as it was. The admission to Willowbrook was withdrawn the same week. I never once set foot in the place. The weeks after I got home from the hospital were slow, and I mean that literally. I was on a walker for 6 weeks, then a cane for 4 more, Harold bringing over soup on Tuesdays, and setting up the chessboard on my kitchen table instead of outside since the cold had come in for good. Biscuit slept against my bad hip most nights like he understood something the rest of us were still figuring out. Derek came by 3 weeks after the hospital, alone, without Vanessa, and stood in my doorway for a long moment before I let him in. He didn't bring a folder. He brought, instead, a small wrapped box, and inside it was my late husband's pocket watch, the gold one, engraved on the back, to Walter, 30 years, love Peg, which I hadn't seen in almost a year and had assumed, with a quiet, private ache, was simply misplaced somewhere in my own apartment. It had been pawned, he admitted, 11 months earlier, for $800, during the worst of the warehouse fallout. He'd bought it back that week with money from a second job he'd picked up on weekends, a detail he told me flatly, without asking for credit for it. "I'm not asking you to just be fine with this," he said, standing in my kitchen with his hands jammed in his coat pockets like he was 9 years old again, waiting to be sent to his room. "I know it's going to take a long time before you trust me with anything again. I just wanted you to have this back." I set the watch on the shelf where it belonged, next to Walter's photograph, and I told him the truth. "It's going to take a long time. I'm not going to pretend it won't." He nodded like he'd expected exactly that answer, and, for the first time in over a year, hadn't come prepared to argue his way out of it. Over the following months, we rebuilt in small, uneven pieces, none of them dramatic enough on their own to make a scene out of, all of them adding up slowly to something like trust again. In December, 6 weeks after the confrontation, Derek asked if he could come to physical therapy with me, just to sit in the waiting room, no agenda. He brought a crossword and didn't try to talk about anything except the weather and Milo's obsession with a video game I didn't understand. I let him come 3 more times after that. I noticed, without saying so, that he never once brought up money. In January, the first restitution payment landed in Carol Ann's office 2 days early. I didn't call him to acknowledge it. Carol Ann told me later that Derek had asked her, almost sheepishly, whether early was better or worse than on time, like a boy checking his own homework before turning it in. She told him early was fine. He was early again in February. By March, I let Sophie and Milo come stay the night at my apartment for the first time in over a year, supervised by nobody but me, which felt like its own small verdict in my favor. Milo ate an entire sleeve of the shortbread I keep for Harold's chess visits and asked, at least 4 times, whether Biscuit could sleep in his room, and I said no, at least 4 times, and he seemed satisfied with the ritual of asking anyway. Sophie helped me organize my recipe box by category, insisting, with the seriousness only a 9-year-old can muster, that my system of just whatever's on top was not, in fact, a system. Holiday gatherings slowly stopped being minefields. At the following Thanksgiving, back at Derek and Vanessa's house, I brought the sweet potato casserole again. Pecan crust, my mother's recipe, unchanged, and it sat, this time, in the center of the table without comment, without being nudged toward the fruit tray, and Vanessa served herself a second helping without being asked to. Nobody said anything about it being a milestone. It simply was one, quietly, the way most real repair tends to be. Derek made every restitution payment on time. All 4 years' worth eventually accounted for on Carolyn's ledger, though we're still only through the first year as I tell you this. He picked up a second bookkeeping certification of his own, oddly enough, at a community college 2 towns over, something he mentioned almost embarrassed, like he expected me to find it funny that the son who'd once dismissed my shop ledger experience was now studying the very thing I'd spent a career doing. I didn't find it funny. I found it, quietly, one of the more hopeful things I'd heard him say in years. Sophie asked me, one Sunday in the spring, very seriously, whether I was going to knit her another cardigan, and when I said yes, she said, "Good. I like that one. I don't care what Mom said." 9 years old, and sharper than half the adults in that family, myself included some days. I set one boundary early, and I have not moved it since. No one manages my finances but me, no exceptions, no matter how convenient it might someday seem. I told Derek this plainly, once, sitting across from him at my own kitchen table, not as a punishment, but as a fact he needed to hear stated out loud. "I love you," I said. "That isn't in question. But you don't get access to my accounts again. Not this year. Not in 10 years. Not if I break my other hip." He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "That's fair." And I believed him, because by then he'd earned enough small moments of believability to make the words land instead of just pass through. Carol and still gets copies of my statements, not because I don't trust myself, but because I've learned that even the most careful ledger benefits from a second set of eyes that isn't standing to gain from what it finds. Derek has never once pushed against that boundary again. I think, in his own way, he's relieved not to be trusted with it. It was never really love that made him ask for it in the first place, and I think some part of him always knew that. A boundary held without apology, I've found, does more for a relationship than 100 boundaries stated and then quietly walked back the first time someone looks hurt about them. If you are the quiet one in your family, the one people assume is slower, softer, easier to manage than you actually are, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Sometimes the people who love you the most, when they're desperate or scared or in over their heads, will try to shrink you down to a size that's easier for them to handle. You don't have to shout to prove them wrong. You just have to keep your own records, trust your own mind, and let the truth do the loud part for you. If this story reminded you of something in your own family, a paper you almost signed, a call you're glad you made, a quiet moment where you chose to slow down instead of trust too fast, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments below.